Yes. So good afternoon, everybody. I will start with sustainability, actually, before getting on to climate. So going back to 2002, I find myself in the Niger Delta inspecting a newly constructed block of toilets. And the reason was that I was the head of sustainable development for Shell at the time. And I was traveling with John Elkington, whom some of you may know, who's a well-known sustainability consultant and author, because we wanted to see for ourselves what the idea of sustainability meant, you know, in the context of a rather challenging environment like the Niger Delta. And here you have Chief Austin Olohu greeting me for the opening of this community center, which included the famous block of toilets. Now, toilets are actually really important, as you know, and so communities who don't have access to them have much higher health risks. But it obviously misses the greater picture. Now, the sustainability at Shell was about a lot more than toilets. There were West Pacific gray whales and biodiversity and climate change and all these issues. And in essence, it was a patient umbrella that accommodated every issue that people were concerned about, which in itself is a problem, right? Our group was recognized, you know, with getting every possible award, the number one on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index and all of that stuff. But yet, as we're heading towards the COP here in Paris, it's pretty clear that these kinds of umbrella concepts in the context of an important player like Shell don't even scratch the surface of what needs to happen. And I think that's a real problem with the way we use the idea of sustainability as we get to this issue of climate change. So in the same year, in 2002, I was very worried that actually this was a term that was a hostage to fortune and lacked intellectual running room in a sense. And together with Angela, who just disappeared, I think, she just sat in the corner before, she was a colleague at Shell, Angela Wilkinson, who's now at the OECD, we wrote a proposal for Shell's board that we should reframe sustainability in terms of complex systems as a better way of understanding and actually getting to some serious understanding of what could be done. Needless to say, it met with confused glares at Shell's board, and that was the end of that story. But ideas don't just stop there. So many years later, in fact, last year I published this book together with David Colander, who's a well-known American economist. And it was to explore that idea. So what is it that complexity and complexity science can contribute to in the public policy area, and particularly for wicked problems such as climate change? So in the book, we tell the extraordinary history and David's a historian of economics, the history of economics in the 20th century has to be one of the strangest chapters in intellectual history. So it is very well worth taking it in and understanding how it got from where it started to where we are now. Complexity economics is taking its first baby steps, and we heard some comments to that this morning. There's some fascinating research going on, but it's certainly at the very beginning. So the point we're trying to make in this book is that we should think of this as in terms of frames and narratives. So the policy choices are framed typically in terms of economics of control. Right? What can the state do? What can we regulate? What interventions can we make? You'll recognize those narratives. Or in terms of market fundamentalist frames, people who say, you know, vaguely inspired by neoclassical economics, that, you know, markets are a better source of solutions for all those questions there on the horizon. And the point we try to make in the book is that there is actually such a thing as a complexity frame on public policy questions that has narratives and language associated with it that would lead to different policy options than you would consider in the other two frames. And the point isn't saying that the complexity frame gives you better policy choices. But, and I repeat that because I've noticed that people don't hear if I say it once, which is kind of an interesting empirical thing. It is not a better frame, as I've just said, but it is an additional frame. And the question that policymakers should be competent to answer is, what is my best choice of frame for this problem at this time, and to be able to have a debate about that. And there are issues for which fundamental market developments are fine, but this is the expansion we think that's required. It's important to reflect on the connection between the frame and the science. And one of the problems I think that's occurred in the 20th century is that the economics of control and the market fundamentalist frame have a science basis, obviously, in neoclassical economics and other schools of economics. The problem, as this little image tries to ascertain, is that the pillars actually don't support the frame. And there's nothing wrong with not knowing enough about your science, because that's human. What is wrong is about misrepresenting the degree of your knowledge. And that is what seems to have occurred in the course of the 20th century, is an overreach and you know, the classic stories about the macroeconomic models as supporting policy. They can give some policy advice, but certainly cannot prove what the right policy is. And the absolutely crucial thing, I think, is for complexity science not to fall into the same trap. And you know, the temptation is great to say that we will have, you know, better models that will support your policies, and you know, if you just listen to us complexity scientists, you'll get better recommendations. And while that will be increasingly true in some specific areas, I think the humbleness to be honest about what is known and what is unknown is incredibly important. And the point we make in the book is that even without the basis of the science, there's a lot of richness to be had in framing issues, policy issues, through this complexity frame. And so, as I heard the presentations this morning, you know, there is this, you know, natural tendency among scientists to say, you know, we'll have a better mousetrap, and we'll prove to you, and that will help you make policy. And I think keeping a sense of that gap is really important. So let me give you just a little example of what that, you know, what that different framing of policy sounds like. So if you take German solar policy, right, everybody knows about, you've referred to it. If you look at German solar policy through, and certain newspapers will do that, right, through this lens of control, they will say, oh, German policy, solar policy is a great example of the government setting a vision, stepping in, putting regulation in place, and creating change on a massive scale. Great example of government action at its best. You pick up another newspaper, they'll say, no, you don't understand. Actually, this is a great example of getting incentives right, and then the market organized itself to deliver more cost-effective solar panels. It's, you know, the power of the market and innovation. So the question is, so what's a complexity frame narrative about the German solar policy? Well, I would suggest there may be two. One is, and you may share that experience, is when you put solar panels on your roof, it becomes an identity thing, right? Your neighbors ask you, who are you? Why did you do that? So are you now a vegetarian? You know, what's that Porsche doing in your garage? So you get this contagion of social norms and this whole identity question. And I think it's not a coincidence that the popular support for the Energiewende in Germany across gender, political parties, and age is at stratospheric level, because, you know, there's a policy that connects to identity. The second angle, I think, of a complexity lens on German solar policy is that basically what the German taxpayer bought was a cost reduction curve. And cost reduction curves need to be purchased. And bizarrely, in our policy language, we have the same word for subsidy if it pays for a cost reduction curve, like for solar, or if it pays for something forever, like British nuclear, which gets subsidized forever. But we use the same word for something that's a radically different policy concept. So here's an example of how, different narratives for the same policy can give you a different insight into them. Now, Eric's excellent book tells the story of the meeting in 1986 at the Santa Fe Institute, where, like in a football game, economists and physicists looked at each other's science, and there was a famous quote by one of the physicists who said, economics is like a Cuban car. It's lovingly maintained but hopelessly outdated technology. There is at the front end, at the cutting edge of economics and economics faculties around the world, that's not true. I mean, there's fantastic work going on, but this is largely true of the economics that influences policy, so that's at the science-policy interface. And that's a real problem. Now, I believe it's actually not a paradigm shift, and it's actually quite important not to speak of this as a paradigm shift, because it's basically going back to assumptions and relaxing assumptions that were made and thinking things anew. Describing something as a paradigm shift can create a huge barrier and have-nots of intellectual correctness, etc. But if you think how this works out in practice, if you look at the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report and you look at the narrative that is there, it says these numbers, and those are the 2-degree scenarios, correspond to an annualized reduction of consumption growth of a median of 0.6% over the century of economic growth. Now, you can't forecast next quarter's GDP to this degree of accuracy, but yet this is the narrative in the executive summary of the IPCC report. If you contrast that with the narratives of the climate scientists who fall over each other rightfully to say, the science is unclear, but it's highly probable, etc. Now, interestingly enough, is buried on page 224 of the IPCC report. It says, first, many of the common methods of valuation in economics are best designed for marginal changes, whereas some of the impacts of climate change and efforts at mitigation are not marginal. So clearly, in the IPCC report, it says that this thing that's the narrative in the summary is wrong. And I think this is an illustration of this difference between the science and the narratives, is that the economist, or certainly the economics section of the IPCC report, has created a narrative which for policymakers is hopeless. Right? As soon as there's a negative economic cost to climate mitigation, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to take any action. Now, if you were to be honest, I think, in terms of what we know, you would have something like this in the summary report. It would say there is considerable uncertainty about economic impact of climate mitigation. Impacts are projected to range from mildly negative to moderately positive, but are heavily model dependent. There are likely to be opportunities to improve the economic outcome over time, or something like this, right? And getting the narrative, the policy narrative right, and I see Doyne being
mildly negative, and that's a strange assessment.
Well, that's the current narrative, right? Is 0.6% negative over a century.
Well,
economically. Sorry, no, this is purely no.
All right, okay.
No, pure. I'm just talking about the. No, thank you for correcting that. No, the other bits are slightly more problematic, but absolutely. No, I'm just focusing on the economic narrative, which is the thing that's the stumbling block for policy. Yeah, and so this is what I'm trying to point is this connection between the difficult connection between the science and the policy, and that we need to be much more conscious about how these things relate, and they are not the same. Policymakers don't follow science largely. The science leads to narratives through some social process, and then that is what colors the policy. So one of the things that I was involved in, together with Carlo Jaeger, in a report that we wrote in 2011, for example, trying to address some of this, of creating a different narrative on climate policy, which we actually presented at the European Commission and here at the OECD, which if you tweak the models slightly, you can create a plausible story around both economic growth and large job growth around decarbonization. We wrote this up and we modeled it, trying to create a different narrative. But you run, I remember sitting in a room at the Parlement in Brussels with the heads of macroeconomic modeling of all the Directorate Generals with arms crossed and listening to this story. And you basically can't get these narratives across. So one last example of where, I think, a complexity policy that can help in these situations is perhaps much more radical. If you think about the lock-in of social norms that we have, this is, some of you may recognize the Pont des Arts here before they changed the barriers a few weeks ago. We clearly have a lock-in in our social norms, right? If you think about climate as just decarbonization, one of the things I would argue for is you need to think about more broadly about what are the social norms we have in society. There's a wonderful quote by Keynes that you may know, who said, the love of money as a possession is distinguished from the love of money as a means for enjoyment of the realities of life will be recognized for what it is, a somewhat disgusting morbidity, one of those semi-criminal, semi-pathological diseases which one hands over with a shudder to the specialists in mental disease. So this was the idea, one of the ideas in the 30s that, the current consumerist, materialistic social norms we have are not obvious, right? They're an emergent property of something. And one of the big questions is how did we end up with the emergence of the social norms that we have? They're not necessarily a natural thing. And so one of the examples we quote in the book quite at length as an ecosystem policy, and some people have referred to it this morning as a way of changing something at a bigger scale. Can you change the rules in such a way that you get different emergent social norms? Is this idea of for-benefit corporations that seems to be sweeping the US at a bipartisan manner, which is rather unique. There are 30 states in the US that have adopted a new set of legislation for a different kind of corporation that would not be, where people can declare what their interest is, whether it's a social good or making profit or some combination thereof. And the curious thing today we have is that if you're a young person trying to do something in society, the first question you'll be asked is, are you doing this for profit or for good? Which of course is a crazy choice, right? And so one of the plausible things we work out in this book is that forced choice may be one of the reasons for the emergence of the social norms that we have. The materialist social norms. So if you want to address that, then these kind of new eco-structures are a way of experimenting with the emergence of a new set of social norms. So those are the kinds of complexity frame policies that we advocate for in the book, on top of doing lots of complexity science, right? It's all great and I'm fascinated by it, but not necessarily connecting the thing to the policy, I think, is important. So in conclusion, these are the two points I wanted to emphasize, is the importance of the economic climate narrative as it exists, and that currently we're in a very schizophrenic state where we have a dominant narrative that clearly is not underpinned by any kind of model that people believe or that is defensible. Yet it is the dominant narrative that influences policymakers, and that's more than an intellectual problem. And many institutions, such as the OECD and universities, etc., are culpable of that connection, and it's fixable and should be fixed. And the second point is that we need to do all the things that you've pointed out in terms of decarbonization, and I've worked on all those things, and they're really important. But we also have to think more deeply in terms of the emergent properties in our societies and where do they come from, and can we think of ways of creating a different set of social norms to emerge, and do some experiments in that direction. Thank you.